So in this section, we are going to be talking about the director and directing and the different types of spaces that are available to directors for the work that they do. So, like the other sections that we've had, we're going to start by taking a look at where directing began. Now, unlike the other classes that we've had, the role of the director, this whole idea of the director, is actually a very new and modern thing. For a long period of time, we didn't have directors as we think of them today. So the role of the director really starts around the mid 1800s. And it starts for pretty much the same reason that we talked about in the section on acting and the method. We have these two new fields rise, the fields of psychology and sociology. And these two new fields are changing the way that everyone is thinking about art, thinking about theater. And just like it changed the fields of acting, it in turn created the need for this person in the show called the director to be the main interpretive voice. Now, that that doesn't mean that before this time there wasn't anybody taking on the responsibilities of a director. Previously, it was either the playwright or the lead actor in the show would take on some of the responsibilities that we now associate to the director, but they still weren't directors like we think of them today. So, for example, in ancient Greece, the playwright would probably be the one to tell the actors when to enter and where to exit. It was really the playwright who would be directing the actors around the stage. If you go to Elizabethan England during the time of Shakespeare, it was usually the lead actor who would take on some of the responsibilities of the director. But again, this would really only be in terms of telling the actors where to go on stage, when to enter, when to exit. There wasn't really an interpretive voice interpreting the script and working with the actors on their characters. So it wasn't really a director like we think of them today. Now, the again with the rise of psychology and sociology, as we start to think about human beings in a sense of how, or trying to figure out how the character is who they is when the play starts. As the actors doing that work, there is now a need for a single person to be kind of the deciding voice in the room as to how everyone in the production is going to interpret that character. But there's something that happens even before that that really sparks directing as well. And it goes to who we consider to be the first ever director. So the person who goes down in history as the first ever director is someone by the name of George II, Duke of Saxe-Meiningen. For the purposes of this class, we'll just refer to him as George II. But he is the one who goes down in history as the first ever director. He becomes the Duke of a town in Germany called Saxe-Meiningen in 1866. And Saxe-Meiningen was known primarily for their very famous acting troupe that they had there, the Meiningen Ensemble. And that troupe of actors were legendary in Germany and all around Europe. And George II was somebody who was very much in tune with theater. He was heavily involved in the theater, and so when he took over, when he became the Duke of that town, he took over control of the troupe. Now, one of the first things he did, well, one of the things that he did that drastically changed how people were thinking about theater at the time, is that he believed that his shows needed to be historically accurate in all aspects. And so that in turn made him have a big emphasis on sets and costumes and props. He wanted all of them to be completely authentic. And he went to far extremes. You know, somebody was playing a knight, they would wear actual chainmail. If they had a sword, they would be carrying around actual saber swords. So he wanted everything to be as authentic as possible. And previously, before him, there wasn't as much emphasis on sets and costumes. When we do our class on theatrical genres, you will we'll dive deeper into this aspect. But before this, in most periods of theater history, there wasn't really much of an emphasis. For example, in Elizabethan England, there were no sets and costumes. You would be wearing your normal everyday clothes, and that's what you would wear on stage. And there wouldn't be anything on stage to represent a location. The location was represented entirely in the dialogue. And so when George II comes along, he says, no, I want the stage to look like the location that the story is taking place in. So he creates this big, elaborate spectacle of a production, and the Meiningen players start traveling around, and it starts to pick up in popularity, this style of theater. There were a couple other things he did that were kind of a little crazy as well. It said that he would rehearse his shows for however long he felt they needed to be rehearsed. So sometimes that could be a month, 3 months, a year. He had no set opening date. And so he would rehearse until he felt the show was ready to be opened. Um, and of course, the way that he was able to do that was that he was the Duke and he had a lot of money. So he could continue to pay people while they were rehearsing. And also, it's interesting that the whole idea of prop shops around Europe really started to spark up because of him. A prop shop is a place that you can go to rent specific items from different time periods, so that if you're doing a show and say you need a radio from the 40s, it's generally would be a very difficult thing to find, but you can go to what's called a prop shop and see if they have it, and if they do, then you can rent it from them for a certain fee. And this started to spark up in the late 1800s around Europe because as people saw George II's shows, everyone else in turn wanted to have the staging element, the production element of their shows be as authentic as his. And so people started selling and renting random items for people to do shows with. So this created a big emphasis on the staging, on the production value. Now, eventually, Konstantin Stanislavski will see George II's shows and will take what George II was emphasizing in terms of production value and include that into what he's doing with the method. And so the combination of those two things really creates the director as we know them today. The person who's going to be interpreting the production elements, the visual elements of the show, and the character development and the acting with the actors. So Stanislavski will go on and kind of perfect the role of director as we know it today. But it's really George II who goes down as our first ever director. So let's take a look at what directing actually is, how it exists today, and what the director actually does. Now, a quick note though, before we continue further, for this specific section about directing, unlike the other sections we've had so far about playwriting and acting, and even when we get to the part about producing, with directing specifically, we are only talking about stage directors. We're not talking about film directors. When we talked about playwriting and we talked about acting, there is a lot of carryover, between the field of playwriting and screenwriting and acting for the stage and acting for the film. When it comes specifically to directing, though, I mean, though there are some similarities and there is a little bit of carryover, what a stage director does is vastly different from what a film director does. And it's not that one is more important than the other or one does more work than the other. It's just that it's two very different processes to come up with to get to your finished product. So when we talk, what we're talking about today is mainly to do with stage directors and not film directors. So, talking about stage director, what is the director and what do they do? Well, the one thing that they do, first and foremost, above all other things, is that they are the person responsible for keeping a cohesive production concept amongst the actors and designers. So let's take we'll look at the first part of that. The person responsible for keeping a cohesive production concept. So what does that really mean? What is a production concept? So a production concept refers to the way in which you're going to interpret the script. That could seem a little odd because, how could there be multiple ways to interpret a script? But of course, you might also be thinking, well, of course, there are different ways to interpret the script. It really depends on the production and what you're doing. Production concepts can be kind of loud and in your face when you're doing the classics, especially when you're doing Shakespeare's work. People will always assign these very large, elaborate production concepts to Shakespeare's work. They'll take the play, but they'll set it in modern times. Something like it's Romeo and Juliet, but it's in the Wild West or something like that. One of the probably the most famous ones being that Romeo and Juliet movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, where they took the exact same script, but they set it in present day and added modern elements to it. Instead of swords, they had guns, and um, the I guess the press was or the newsmakers and journalists were elements of the production. So you could do something like that. That movie 10 Things I Hate About You, which is an adaptation of Taming of the Shrew. So again, taking Taming of the Shrew and setting it in modern times. So these are kind of elaborate in your face production concepts. But even if you are doing a production of a show ex- exactly as written and as intended, there is still a production concept to it. There's still an interpretation of a character. Because with the addition of psychology and sociology and acting and directing, there's a lot that you need to think about in terms of the characters and the story that happens before the play even begins. There's a lot of stuff you have to fill in the blanks for in order to fully develop the characters and the situation. And so if you're going to be doing that, if you're going to be creating things, then just like you need a playwright in order to keep some type of cohesion in the script, you'll need somebody who is going to keep some cohesion in that interpretation, and that was the person who we call the director. And they do this, let's look at the second half of this sentence. They do this mainly with the actors and designers. These are the two main groups of people that work underneath the director. If you think about it, these are the two most important groups of people in the production. They're actually the only people whose work you really see. If you think about it, the playwright, yes, they write the scripts, but in the end, the audience isn't reading the script. They're hearing the words from the actors. So you don't actually get to see a word of what the playwright actually wrote technically. You're hearing what the actors say. And it doesn't matter what the director imagines up about the production. In the end, it matters what the designers actually create. I mean, obviously, they're supposed to create what the director wants, but in the end, you're seeing the finished product from the designers. So the only things you see are the visual elements that the designers create, and the performances delivered and the words delivered by the actors. And so because both of those people are groups of people, and it means you're going to have multiple people interpreting the same thing, and so you need one deciding voice in the production itself. And so that is where the main responsibility of the director comes from. There are some other responsibilities that they have, so we'll take a look at those. So we have the first one up there, keeping a cohesive production concept amongst the actors and designers. Another big one that they have, very technical one, is something that we call blocking. Blocking is the term for the path an actor walks on stage. So the path an actor walks on stage. You remember when we talked about the method, Stanislavski said that an actor must always be in control of their body at all times. And the rule also applies to directing. You must always be in control of what's happening on stage at all times. So no matter how much you think that something looks spontaneous on stage, more times than not, it was probably predetermined. And this idea especially goes for all of the movements the actors make on stage. Every movement the actor makes is preset, predetermined. It's mainly just so that because there are so many moving parts to a show, you have multiple actors walking around the stage, you have sets coming in and out, you have light cues, hitting different spots of the stage. Um, you need to make sure everyone is going to be in the same place at all times. So everything is preset. So usually what will happen in a production is at the very beginning, the director and the actors will go into a rehearsal room. They'll take the script and the director will tell them to get up and start moving around the stage. And eventually, you'll stumble through like that. The actors will try certain things. They'll try this, they'll try that, see what works, see what doesn't. Eventually, you'll reach a point in the production where the director will say, okay, everything that you're now doing is set in stone, and that's what you're going to be doing for the rest of this production. And it's true for every show. Take, for example, on Broadway right now, the Phantom of the Opera, which has been open at the point when I recorded this for 30 years. Maybe it's now more from when you're listening to this. But if you go see Phantom of the Opera today, the blocking that you see is the exact same blocking the director created 30 years ago. And multiple actors have come in and left the show. And every time a new actor comes in, they learn that original blocking that was created by the director and the original actor 30 years ago. They don't create anything new. They come in and they learn the existing blocking, and then they are put into the show there. So it always stays the same. The only, I guess, exception to this would be if maybe you move theaters. So, for instance, The Lion King has been open for a long time, but they are now actually in a different theater from the one they opened in. And I imagine the blocking is still pretty much the same, but whenever you change a theater and there's a different space, then there might be the need to change something. But if you watch a recording of opening night performance of The Lion King and you go see it now and it's new theater, it's probably going to be exactly the same. So blocking refers to, again, the path the actor walks on stage. So you can see here in our example, I have set up a small little set here. Just two lamps, a bar, a table and chairs, and a sofa chair. So blocking, again, is going to refer to where the actor moves around. So the first part of the blocking, we'll see here, Bill has entered. So Bill enters on that side of the stage. And then the next thing he's going to do, he's going to walk over to the bar. He'll get a drink, and then maybe 3 or 4 lines later, he has a line that he says, and then he walks over to the sofa chair and sits down. And then he stays there for about a page until he gets up and walks to the table and, I don't know, bangs his fist on the table and yells at everybody, and then he exits where he came in. So all of these movements that we see on our stage right now is what we call Bill's blocking, because it's from the moment that he enters the stage to the moment that he has exited the stage. Another responsibility of the director is what we call creating a stage picture. So the director is going to create something that we call a stage picture. What that refers to is the arrangement of the actors and all the visual elements together on stage at any given moment. So I have there 2 pictures of the large musical productions on Broadway, the one on the left being the show Kinky Boots, and the one on the right being the show Dear Evan Hansen. And so you can see there's a lot of, I guess, production elements and actors on stage, and they're all, facing a certain way and posed a certain way. And this is what we would call a stage picture. And so because theater is a visual art form, the director is the one responsible for the visual element. They're going to try to create certain points in the show that are visually appealing to the audience. Usually something that has something to do thematically with the show as well. Um, if you look at the picture on the left, Kinky Boots, you have in the very center of the stage the two main characters who during the course of that story, those two characters need to come together and build a sturdy boot and um, and save that factory. And so the stage picture, though it looks very colorful and fun, it also has a thematic meaning to the show. The two of them posed in the center of the stage, both holding boots together that kind of bring them together to look like how two boots that match that come together, and the two of them holding them up, signifying that they are now together and one. And so this stage picture has a thematic meaning to the show. Um, so this is something that the director will try to do, create these stage pictures. And in doing that, we have to now take a look at how the director will direct the actors to stand on stage, because there are certain ways that you stand. If you look here, there's two terms that the director will use with the actors, and that is, one is called facing out, and the other is something we call profile. So if you notice, whenever you watch a live production on stage, you'll notice the actors are very rarely ever standing profile to you like that. Most of the time, the actors who are engaged in the scene, who are engaged with the audience, are facing out, like you see there. And facing out means, even though they're facing each other, their heads are turned. If you notice, their chest is out and open to us. And there's just something subconsciously about human beings where we pay more attention to someone if we see the front of them. Obviously we pay more attention as well if their face is facing us and looking at us, but if their face is not looking at us, we will still pay more attention to the person whose chest is open and facing us than one who's not. And so, if you have two characters who are going to sit and speak to each other for an extended period of time, the director will have them face out like that, especially if there's going to be other people on stage. So in this picture where the two actors are facing out, you notice there are two other actors on stage. So with these two actors facing out, it makes sure that the audience keeps their attention on them. Now, a way that you can direct the audience's eye sometimes is by having characters profile, like the picture on the right. Now, in this specific picture, both actors are facing profile, but ultimately there might not be anybody else on stage, so it'll still work because there's only the two actors that the audience can look at. But if you want to direct the audience's eye, you will usually have an actor stand profile, because if you look at an actor on stage standing profile, it means that their chest is not open to you, they're looking somewhere else. So immediately you're going to look where they are looking. And then maybe the person that they're looking at is now standing facing out, and your attention will stay there. And this is where a main difference between directing for the stage and directing for film comes in. Something that you need to examine when you're directing is the difference between what drives the story in theater as opposed to what drives the story in film. So when you're watching a movie, if you think about this for a second, imagine yourself in a movie theater. You're sitting down. What are you physically looking at? You're looking at the screen, and your attention is going to be on the screen for the entire time. So when you're directing a film, and even when you're writing a screenplay, what you are outlining is what the action that is happening at any given moment. What is happening on the screen? What do we see on the screen? So it doesn't matter who's speaking. Somebody could be speaking, but the image on the screen is somebody else's face. 30-foot close up of somebody's face and a single tear falls down. So in film, you are directing what is seen on the screen because the audience is only looking at the screen. In theater, it's the exact opposite. What drives the story in theater? Well, imagine yourself now sitting in a theater looking at a stage. And so what are you physically looking at? You're physically looking at the stage. But then what are you looking at on the stage? Well, you're looking at the actors. Well, if there's multiple actors on stage, which one of them are you looking at? And the answer to that is the person speaking. We are always looking at the person speaking. Next time that you're out somewhere in public, if you're on a train, on a bus, I don't know, in a courtyard, in a cafeteria somewhere, you'll be facing one direction, but if somebody suddenly stands up and yells, what's going to happen? Everyone's attention goes directly to that person because they are now the one speaking. So in theater, what drives the story is the dialogue. So the director has an issue where they have to direct the audience's eye because the audience can look anywhere they want on the stage. And so a way that you can do that is by having your actor stand profile. So if somebody's going to be on one far side of the stage speaking, and it's important that everyone on this in the audience is looking at that actor, if you have 4 or 5 other actors on stage, you're going to make sure they are all facing profile and looking at that character. Because if one of them is facing out, then you might have audience members who are paying attention to that actor and not necessarily the one speaking. Because subconsciously we're thinking, oh, this guy is facing us. He's going to do something, or it's important that we watch him or her. Maybe it's important to see what their reaction is to what's being said. And if you as a director don't want that to happen, you need to make sure that you adjust your stage picture so that the actors are facing profile to the important character on stage. Same thing with actors facing their back to the audience. When an actor turns their back to the audience, it doesn't matter what they're saying. Instinctively, we lose focus on that person. For one, it'll be much more difficult to hear what they're saying because their words are being directed somewhere else. But also, when someone turns their back to us, there's a kind of subliminal message there that my interaction with you is done. And so if it's important, if the actor is standing on stage and what they're saying is important, well, if they now have their back to you, you're not going to hear it. And so it's another way to make sure to direct your audience's eye to specific actors on stage. If you don't want the audience to look at one actor and you want them to look at the other, well, the one that you don't want them to focus on, maybe you have them turn their back to the audience. And then as we're looking around the stage, we'll see, well, that guy has his back to me. I'm not paying attention to him. That guy's looking profile. What's he looking at? Oh, he's looking at that actor on the other side of the stage. Let me focus over there. So the way that your actors are facing on stage is something that the director will very much be paying attention to throughout the rehearsal process. The other responsibility that we're going to look at for the director is what we call keeping the production's pace, or basically the speed of the performance. Every show can go at a different pace, a different rate, and it's up to the director to figure out how fast or how slow they want the production to progress. And so generally speaking, usually dramas will have a slower pace and comedies will have a faster pace. This is one of those moments in this lecture where there is some carryover with film. It's kind of the same thing with film. And in film, this happens more with the editing of the film. How quickly are the images on screen going to change? So with theater, you generally want, and film, you generally want comedies to have a faster pace. So if you think about it, what's the one thing that will kill any joke, no matter how funny it is? If the audience has enough time to think about it. Whenever you tell a joke, no matter how great it is, if the audience has enough time to think about it, it's no longer funny. You want to tell the joke, you want to show the joke, and then move on to the next thing and just keep it going so that the audience has enough time to think about it. They're already on to the next joke and they're laughing. On the flip side of that, if you're doing a drama, well, you want a slower pace. You want the audience to have time to sit and think about what's happening. You want the audience to take in the information they're finding out about the awful things that are happening to the character, and then you want them to have time to sit and think about how awful it is and how much they sympathize with the character, and then feel all the emotions they're supposed to feel. So in order to do that, you need a slower pace generally. I do emphasize the point generally because it really depends on the type of show. You can have a drama that moves really quickly and is still just as effective. You can have a comedy that moves slowly that's also just as effective. It really depends on, well, it depends on the production concept that the director has for the show. But the director has a lot of influence on how long a show will be. One example of this is a play of mine that I wrote a long time ago, and I did the initial production for it at at a college, and or I did the initial production not at a college, but on my own, independently produced. And this one director had an interesting production concept to it. He wanted to add in, a lot of other elements to the show. Like, for example, there was the face of a barn that we built, and the characters raised the face of the barn, and there's a funeral procession at another point, and there's a lot of interesting elements to it. And the director wanted the audience to have some time to sit with the characters and really think about what's going on. So that show, the running time for that show was 2.5 hours with an intermission. So after that show was done, there was a professor at a college who saw it and wanted to do a production of that show with her students at the college. And it was only a couple months, it was going to open a couple months after this show had already closed. So I didn't have time to change the script at all. So I gave her the exact same script that the other director had. So word for word, exactly the same. Now, the second director's production concept was vastly different. She didn't want to have as much time. She didn't want to spend as much time thinking about the characters, or at least she didn't want the audience to. And so there was a much quicker pace to that production. Part of the story is that things are happening to the main character quickly, and she's kind of losing control of her life. And so in the second production, the director wanted the audience to experience things in the same way that the main character was experiencing them. So she didn't want the audience to have as much time to sit and think about what's going on. And so she didn't add a lot of other elements in. And so in the end, that production ran for an hour and a half with no intermission. So you have two productions, both using the exact same script, not a single word different, and there was a difference of an hour in running time between both shows. So the director has a big influence in the speed of the production, the pace of the production. And this is the same thing in film, like I said, and it goes with the editing of a film. The speed of the movie and film will refer to how quickly the images on the screen change. And you'll notice that whenever you see a comedy, the images are constantly changing very quickly because you don't want the audience to sit and think about what's happening. But if it's a drama, you'll notice the images don't change as quickly. That's why you'll have that slow panning close up right up to the face of our main character as they, overlook the horizon and contemplate their life or something like that. It'll be a much slower pace. In fact, you don't even necessarily need to watch the movies in order to see an example of this. Just watch the trailers. If it's a trailer for a comedy, a lot of quick changing images. If it's a trailer for a drama, usually have much a slower pace of changing images in it. So this is going again toward the pacing of the production. One similarity in the directing responsibilities between stage and film. So we're going to move on to the second part of this section, something that's called theatrical spaces. So in order for a director to accomplish what they're trying to do with their production concept, there's a couple things they need to know about the different types of spaces that they'll be in. So the first thing is something that we call stage directions. And Stage directions are a way for a director to to direct an actor on stage in terms of which direction to go, which way to go. So if you think about it, it's a really important element because if the director tells the actor go left and the actor who's standing facing them goes to their left, it's going to be the exact opposite direction the director wants. And so the director is, oh no, no, I mean your other left. And then the actor goes that way. And you do this over and over, and it eventually gets really old. So there is a set way that directors will instruct actors which way to move on stage, and that's called stage directions. So stage directions are always determined by the actor standing on stage looking at the audience. So if you are the actor standing on stage looking at the audience, your left is stage left and your right is stage right. And then same thing for the depth of the stage. When the actor gets closer to the audience, that's called downstage or going downstage. And when the actor goes farther away from the audience, that's called going upstage. So with these two ideas in mind, you can label a basic stage. So here we have a rectangular stage. So given what I just said about stage directions, what is the first thing we're going to look for on this stage? We need to label the directions on the stage. What is the first thing we're going to look for? And if you think about what we just went through, the one defining characteristic for both things, stage left, stage right, upstage and downstage, is where the audience is. Because again, all of these stage directions are based on if you are the actor standing on stage looking at the audience. So what you need to know is, where is the audience? So the first thing you always want to look for is, where is the audience? So here I give you the audience on the lower part of the rectangle. So now that you know where the audience is, the rest of the stage directions can be determined. So if you are an actor on that rectangular stage looking in the direction of the audience, this direction will be your left. And because that would be your left, this is what we call stage left. And then similarly, the other way on your right would be stage right. Now, when you go through the depth of the stage, if you're going in that direction, then you're going toward the audience, which means that will be downstage. And since that is downstage and you now know where stage left and stage right is, you can label all the other points on the bottom of the stage there. So you just saw on the bottom there down right pop up. The reason why that is down right is because that is the side closest to the audience, so it's downstage. And that is the stage right side of that stage. So that is down right, then down center, and then down left. Now, when you go in the other direction, you're going further away from the audience. And so because you're going further away from the audience, you know that this is the upstage side of this stage. And again, because you know where stage right and stage left is, you can label the other 3 points. So up there we have up right, we have up center, and we have up left. And then that leaves us our last and final stage direction, the most famous of all the stage directions, center stage. So these are your nine basic points of a stage, and you can see this in one of the handouts that was provided for you online. The 9 basic points of the stage. So now, if you look at the other handout that was provided for you, the one that shows the different theatrical spaces, we're going to look at the different types of stages. So a type of stage is determined by how many sides of the stage the audience is on. So how many sides of the stage that the audience is on determines what type of stage, or what I guess you would call the classification of the stages. So let's look at the first one on your handout. As you can see here, the audience is on one side of the stage. They are only on one side of that rectangular stage. So this is what we call a proscenium stage, or as it says here, a proscenium theater. This is the most predominant form of stage that you're going to find. Most stages, most theaters are proscenium stages. And that means, a proscenium stage means the audience is on one side of the stage. Then the next image on your handout is one where you can see the audience is on three sides of the stage. So when the audience is on three sides, we call that a thrust stage. And the way it was always explained to me, or the best way to remember it, is that the stage kind of thrusts out into the audience. And so that's how you would know it's a thrust stage. But in the end, the fact that the audience is on three sides of the stage, we know it's called a thrust. The next example on your handout is one where we see the audience is on all four sides of the stage. And so we call that an arena stage. Or you might see it also referred to, or also known as, theater in the round. And it would be theater in the round because a lot of times these types of stages, it's a circular stage, the audience surrounds it, and so it's theater in the round. But no matter what, whenever the audience is on all sides of the stage, we call that an arena stage. Then there's one last example on your handout, and this is what we call a flexible stage. Now, this is one example of a flexible stage, but a flexible stage could be many different things. And that's because a flexible stage is any type of non-symmetrical stage configuration. So anytime you have some type of non-symmetrical shape and any type of audience configuration, something that doesn't fall under the realm of proscenium, thrust, or arena, you would call that a flexible stage. You see these a lot with award shows. Award shows will use flexible stages sometimes. That's mainly because you need two different staging areas. One staging area where the camera is going to be on a presenter so that you can have the other staging area being set up for some musical performance. And then when the cameras switch over to the other staging area while they're recording the musical performance, you can now set up the podium for the next presenter. So award shows will use that. A lot of times you'll see this done with what's called dinner theater. Dinner theater is a very popular form of theater in regional areas of the country, regional theater. And that is the type of show where, as it sounds, you go and you sit down at a table and you're served dinner. It's kind of like a restaurant, but while you're eating your dinner and being served, there's a play happening around you. A lot of times these will be murder mysteries of some kind, and so you watch the show as you're eating dinner. And sometimes a lot of times they'll have alternate different endings, and the audience votes on the end or which end of the show they want to see, something like that. But because it's a non-traditional type of stage, there's not one set staging area. It kind of happens around the tables in this restaurant. You would call that a flexible stage. So now that we know the different types of stages, let's figure out how we would label stage directions and all these different stages. So the proscenium theater is pretty straightforward. The example that I showed you before, the example in your handout, is a proscenium stage because I am only showing that the audience is on one side of that rectangle. So a proscenium theater like this, you would label exactly the same as we showed before, exactly the same as the handout I gave you. Now let's take a look at a thrust stage. So a thrust stage, the audience is on three sides. So it might make it a little tricky in terms of how to define left and right and downstage and upstage. Because remember, left and right is based on if you're the actor standing on stage looking at the audience, your left is left, your right is right. Well, you could be facing any one of those three staging areas, and that would change left and right. But the one way that you can determine it, especially on thrust stages, is that we do have one side of the stage where there is no audience. And so because of that, whenever you get closer to that wall, you're going away from the audience. So there is a preset upstage section of this stage, which would be that top portion where there's no audience. And since that is upstage, the exact opposite side will be downstage. And now that we know upstage and downstage, you can determine which side is left and which side is right. And so you'll see in the example here, the stage directions are actually the same as you would see on your handout again, the same as the proscenium one. But the reason for it is a little different for a thrust. With a thrust, we know where upstage is, and that's why the rest of it is determined as it is. So let's take a look at an arena stage. How would you label stage directions on an arena? Again, the left and right is hard to determine because if you're the actor standing on stage looking at the audience, well, you could be looking in any direction and you're looking at audience. And again, upstage and downstage is difficult because remember, downstage is when you get closer to the audience and upstage is when you go further away from the audience. Well, no matter which way you move on this stage, you're simultaneously getting closer to audience and further away from audience. So how would you label stage directions on an arena? Well, the answer is it's kind of a trick question. There is no preset stage direction. You kind of just have to make it up. And so every director will have a different way in which they're going to do it, depending on the style of the director. So for example, you might have one show come in here, and those two rectangles at the bottom now, those are the entry doors to the theater. And so at the beginning of the production, the director will say, okay, the side of the stage that the entry doors are on, that's downstage. And so now you can label the rest of that stage. So if that is what we're going to call our downstage, then the rest of the 9 points can be labeled accordingly. But then the next show that comes in, that director will say, well, the clock on that wall, that's what we're going to say is downstage. So the wall that has the clock is downstage. Well, so now the stage directions are completely different, and that one is just as valid as the previous one. And then the next show that comes in, you might have a director that says, okay, north is downstage. You know, you have a pretentious director, and now you got to bring a compass to every damn rehearsal. And so now that would be what your staging looks like. And though it would be a pretentious way of doing it, it's just as valid as the other two. So there is no inherent stage direction with an arena stage. You just have to make it up at the very beginning of the entire process and then use that consistently throughout. So now the thing to think about that is really important for a director is finding out what is the strongest point on your stage. So there's something called the strongest point on any stage. And the strongest point is defined as the place where an actor can stand and the audience can see the front of them comfortably. So the place where an actor can stand and the audience can see the front of the actor comfortably. This would be your strongest point. So let's take a look at a proscenium stage. Where would be your strongest point? Now, a lot of times the debate will be either center stage or down center. Now, this specific example and most proscenium stages, if you think about down center, if you were to stand down center on this stage, you look at the example there, right at the tip of the apron there, you're going to be standing right on top of those audience members. And so most of the first couple rows are going to have to crane their neck in order to see you. So it's not going to be very comfortable for them. So the strongest point on the stage is actually center stage. It's a reason why it's the most famous stage direction, because it's the strongest point on the most predominantly used type of theater, a proscenium theater. So center stage will be your strongest point on a proscenium theater. Now, say for instance, you did have a proscenium theater and the audience starts like 20 feet back from the stage. Well, then in that specific one, you could say down center is your strongest point. But it's very rare that you're going to find a proscenium theater that will have that much space in between the audience and the end of the stage, because theater is still a business. You need to sell tickets. Why would you have all that dead space when you can put in chairs and have people pay money to sit in those seats? So you usually, in most proscenium theaters, the audience is going to go right up to the edge of the stage. And because of that, in the vast majority of proscenium theaters, your strongest point will be center stage. So now let's take a look at a thrust stage. What is your strongest point on this stage? Sometimes people will say center stage for this one. So though center stage was the strongest point on the previous example of proscenium theater, it's not very strong on this stage. And the reason for that is if you were standing center stage, you're going to have your back to the audience that's closest to upright and up left. They're still going to see your back there. And so, because of that, the strongest point on a thrust stage is actually up center. So up center is your strongest point because everyone will see the front of you. The people on the far sides there, up right and up left, though they will be seeing you kind of profile, at least they're seeing part of your front and not any part of your back. And it's also not ideal because if you're standing up center, the audience that's closest to the downstage wall there, though they can see the front of you, you are pretty far from them, but still they can see the front of you. So your strongest point is up center. This is what makes directing on a thrust stage a little difficult, because your strongest point of the stage is actually pretty far from one whole side of your audience. So it can work for certain types of productions, but it really depends on the type of production. So now let's look at an arena stage. And so for the purpose of this example, this director has set that bottom wall there as the downstage, and so those are our 9 points. So what would be the strongest point on an arena stage? Well, it's hard to determine, right? Because no matter which way you stand, your back is to the audience. You can't stand center stage because no matter how you stand center stage, your back is to someone. Well, the answer to this one is that there are 4 equally strong points on the stage, and they're the 4 corners. So those corners where we have upright, up left, down right, and down left, there are 4 equally strong points, and you would stand in the corner, and in that corner, again, just like with the thrust, though the 2 audience sections directly next to you are going to see a kind of profile, at least they're not looking at your back. And then the audience on the opposite side of you can see the front of you. So the corners would be the strongest point. The weakest point on an arena stage is center stage because of that reason, that there's no way you can stand center stage without your back facing someone. Usually if you're going to direct a show center stage, or if you're going to direct a show in an arena stage, you'll put the set pieces center stage to completely eliminate the actor of even having the option of standing center stage. So for the most part, you would do that. Of course, there's always an exception to every rule. There's probably a show out there you can find that didn't put the set pieces center stage and it worked just as well. But for the most part, center stage is your weakest point on an arena stage, which is what makes it a very difficult type of stage to direct on. But with an arena stage, ultimately your strongest point are the 4 corners. And so these are your basic types of stages that you can use: a proscenium stage, a thrust stage, an arena stage, and then a flexible stage. And all of the information about stage directions and the strongest point on each stage is something that the director is going to be very much concerned with in terms of how to create their stage picture and effectively tell the story and display their production concept to the audience.